Chapter 3 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3. To Let by John Galsworthy. Chapter 3. At Robin Hill. Jolyon Forsyte had spent his boy's 19th birthday at Robin Hill, quietly going into his affairs. He did everything quietly now, because his heart was in a poor way, and, like all his family, he disliked the idea of dying. He had never realized how much, till one day 2 years ago he had gone to his doctor about certain symptoms, and been told, "At any moment, on any overstrain." He had taken it with a smile, the natural Forsyte reaction against an unpleasant truth. But, with an increase of symptoms in the train on the way home, he had realized to the full the sentence hanging over him. To leave Irene, his boy, his home, his work, though he did little enough work now, to leave them, for unknown darkness, for the unimaginable state, for such nothingness that he would not even be conscious of wind-stirring leaves above his grave, nor of the scent of earth and grass; of such nothingness that, however hard he might try to conceive it, he never could, and must still hover on the hope that he might see again those he loved. To realize this was to endure very poignant spiritual anguish. Before he reached home that day he had determined to keep it from Irene. He would have to be more careful than man had ever been, for the least thing would give it away, and make her as wretched as himself, almost. His doctor had passed him sound in other respects, and 70 was nothing of an age. He would last a long time yet, if he could. Such a conclusion, followed out for nearly 2 years, develops to the full the subtler side of character. Naturally not abrupt, except when nervously excited, Jolyon had become control incarnate. The sad patience of old people who cannot exert themselves was masked by a smile which his lips preserved even in private. He devised continually all manner of cover to conceal his enforced lack of exertion. Mocking himself for so doing, he counterfeited conversion to the simple life, gave up wine and cigars, drank a special kind of coffee with no coffee in it. In short, he made himself as safe as a Forsyte in his condition could, under the rose of his mild irony. Secure from discovery, since his wife and son had gone up to town, he had spent the fine May day quietly arranging his papers, that he might die to-morrow without inconveniencing anyone, giving, in fact, a final polish to his terrestrial state. Having docketed and enclosed it in his father's old Chinese cabinet, he put the key into an envelope, wrote the words outside, "Key of the Chinese cabinet, wherein will be found the exact state of me, J. F., and put it in his breast pocket, where it would be always about him in case of accident. Then, ringing for tea, he went out to have it under the old oak tree. All are under sentence of death. Jolyon, whose sentence was but a little more precise and pressing, had become so used to it that he thought habitually, like other people, of other things. He thought of his son now. John was 19 that day, and John had come of late to a decision. Educated neither at Eton, like his father, nor at Harrow, like his dead half-brother, but at one of those establishments which, designed to avoid the evil and contain the good of the public school system, may or may not have contained the evil and avoid the good. John had left in April, perfectly ignorant of what he wanted to become. The war, which had promised to go on for ever, had ended just as he was about to join the army, 6 months before his time. It had taken him ever since to get used to the idea that he could now choose for himself. he had held with his father several discussions, from which, under a cheery show of being ready for anything, except, of course, the church, army, law, stage, stock exchange, medicine, business, and engineering, Jolyon had gathered rather clearly that John wanted to go in for nothing. He himself had felt exactly like that at the same age. With him, that pleasant vacuity had soon been ended by an early marriage, and its unhappy consequences. Forced to become an underwriter at Lloyd's, he had regained prosperity before his artistic talent had outcropped. But having, as the simple say, learned his boy to draw pigs and other animals, he knew that John would never be a painter, and inclined to the conclusion that his aversion from everything else meant that he was going to be a writer. Holding, however, the view that experience was necessary even for that profession, there seemed to Jolyon nothing in the meantime for John but university, travel, and perhaps the eating of dinners for the bar. After that one would see, or more probably one would not. In face of these proffered allurements, however, John had remained undecided. Such discussions with his son had confirmed in Jolyon a doubt whether the world had really changed. People said that it was a new age. With the profundity of one not too long for any age, Jolyon perceived that under slightly different surfaces the era was precisely what it had been. Mankind was still divided into two species, the few who had speculation in their souls, and the many who had none, with a belt of hybrids like himself in the middle. John appeared to have speculation. It seemed to his father a bad lookout. With something deeper, therefore, than his usual smile, he had heard the boy say, a fortnight ago, "I should like to try farming, Dad, if it won't cost you too much. It seems to be about the only sort of life that doesn't hurt anybody. Except art, and of course that's out of the question for me." Jolyon subdued his smile and answered, "All right, you shall skip back to where we were under the first Jolyon in 1760. It'll prove the cycle theory, and incidentally, no doubt, you may grow a better turnip than he did." A little dashed, John had answered, "But don't you think it's a good scheme, Dad?" "'Twill serve, my dear, and if you should really take to it, you'll do more good than most men, which is little enough." To himself, however, he had said, "But he won't take to it. I give him 4 years. Still, it's healthy and harmless." After turning the matter over and consulting with Irene, he wrote to his daughter, Mrs. Val Dartie, asking if they knew of a farmer near them on the downs who would take John as an apprentice. Holly's answer had been enthusiastic. There was an excellent man quite close. She and Val would love John to live with them. The boy was due to go tomorrow. Sipping weak tea with lemon in it, Jolyon gazed through the leaves of the old oak tree at that view which had appeared to him desirable for 32 years. The tree beneath which he sat seemed not a day older. So young, the little leaves of brownish gold; so old, the whitey grey-green of its thick, rough trunk. A tree of memories, which would live on hundreds of years yet, unless some barbarian cut it down. Would see old England out at the pace things were going. He remembered a night 3 years before when, looking from his window, with his arm close round Irene, he watched a German aeroplane hovering, it seemed, right over the old tree. Next day they had found a bomb hole in a field on Gage's farm. That was before he knew that he was under sentence of death. He could almost have wished the bomb had finished him. It would have saved a lot of hanging about, many hours of cold fear in the pit of his stomach. He counted on living to the normal Forsyte age of 85 or more, when Irene would be 70. As it was, she would miss him. Still, there was John, more important in her life than himself, John who adored his mother. Under that tree where old Jolyon, waiting for Irene to come to him across the lawn, had breathed his last, Jolyon wondered whimsically whether, having put everything in such perfect order, he had not better close his own eyes and drift away. There was something undignified in so parasitically clinging on to the effortless close of a life wherein he regretted two things only: the long division between his father and himself when he was young, and the lateness of his union with Irene. From where he sat he could see a cluster of apple trees in blossom. Nothing in nature moved him so much as fruit trees in blossom, and his heart ached suddenly because he might never see them flower again. Spring! Decidedly no man ought to have to die while his heart was still young enough to love beauty. Blackbirds sang recklessly in the shrubbery. Swallows were flying high, the leaves above him glistened, and over the fields was every imaginable tint of early foliage, burnished by the level sunlight, away to where the distant smoke-bush blue was trailed across the horizon. Irene's flowers in their narrow beds had startling individuality that evening, little deep assertions of gay life. Only Chinese and Japanese painters, and perhaps Leonardo, had known how to get that startling little ego into each painted flower and bird and beast, the ego, yet the sense of species, the universality of life as well. They were the fellows. "I've made nothing that would live," thought Jolyon. "I've been an amateur, a mere lover, not a creator. Still, I shall leave John behind me when I go." What luck that the boy had not been caught by that ghastly war! He might so easily have been killed, like poor Jolly 20 years ago out in the Transvaal. John would do something some day, if the age didn't spoil him, an imaginative chap. His whim to take up farming was but a bit of sentiment, and about as likely to last. And just then he saw them coming up the field, Irene and the boy, walking from the station with their arms linked. And getting up, he strolled down through the new rose garden to meet them. Irene came into his room that night, and sat down by the window. She sat there without speaking till he said, "What is it, my love?" "We had an encounter to-day." "With whom?" "Soames." Soames! He had kept that name out of his thoughts these last 2 years, conscious that it was bad for him, and now his heart moved in a disconcerting manner, as if it had side-slipped within his chest. Irene went on quietly. "He and his daughter were in the gallery, and afterward at the confectioner's where we had tea." Jolyon went over and put his hand on her shoulder. "How did he look?" "Grey, but otherwise much the same." "And the daughter?" "Pretty. At least John thought so." Jolyon's heart side-slipped again. His wife's face had a strained and puzzled look. "You didn't—" he began. "No, but John knows their name. The girl dropped her handkerchief and he picked it up." Jolyon sat down on the bed. An evil chance. "June was with you. Did she put her foot in it?" "No, but it was all very queer and strained, and John could see it was." Jolyon drew a deep breath and said, "I've often wondered whether we've been right to keep it from him. He'll find out some day." "The later the better, Jolyon. The young have such cheap, hard judgment. When you were 19, what would you have thought of your mother if she had done what I have?" Yes, there it was. John worshipped his mother, and knew nothing of the tragedies, the inexorable necessities of life, nothing of the prisoned grief in an unhappy marriage, nothing of jealousy or passion, knew nothing at all, as yet. "What have you told him?" he said at last. "That they were relations, but that we didn't know them, that you had never cared much for their family, or they for you. I expect he will be asking you." Jolyon smiled. "This promises to take the place of air raids," he said. "After all, one misses them." Irene looked up at him. "We've known it would come some day." He answered her with sudden energy. "I could never stand seeing John blame you. He shan't do that, even in thought. He has imagination, and he'll understand if it's put to him properly. I think I'd better tell him before he gets to know otherwise." "Not yet, Jolyon." That was like her. She had no foresight, and never went to meet trouble. Still, who knew, she might be right. It was ill going against a mother's instinct. It might be well to let the boy go on, if possible, till experience had given him some touchstone by which he could judge the values of that old tragedy, till love, jealousy, longing had deepened his charity. All the same, one must take precautions, every precaution possible. And, long after Irene had left him, he lay awake, turning over those precautions. He must write to Holly, telling her that John knew nothing as yet of family history. Holly was discreet. She would make sure of her husband. She would see to it. John could take the letter with him when he went tomorrow. And so the day on which he had put the polish on his material estate died out with the chiming of the stable clock, and another began for Jolyon in the shadow of a spiritual disorder which could not be so rounded off and polished. But John, whose room had once been his day-nursery, lay awake too, the prey of a sensation disputed by those who have never known it, love at first sight. He had felt it beginning in him with the glint of those dark eyes gazing into his athwart the Juno, a conviction that this was his dream, so that what followed had seemed to him at once natural and miraculous. Fleur! Her name alone was almost enough for one who was terribly susceptible to the charm of words. In a homoeopathic age, when boys and girls were co-educated and mixed up in early life till sex was almost abolished, John was singularly old-fashioned. His modern school took boys only, and his holidays had been spent at Robin Hill with boy friends, or his parents alone. He had never, therefore, been inoculated against the germs of love by small doses of the poison. And now in the dark his temperature was mounting fast. He lay awake, featuring Fleur, as they called it, recalling her words, especially that au revoir, so soft and sprightly. He was still so wide awake at dawn that he got up, slipped on tennis shoes, trousers, and a sweater, and in silence crept downstairs and out through the study window. It was just light. There was a smell of grass. Fleur, he thought. Fleur! It was mysteriously white out of doors, with nothing awake except the birds just beginning to chirp. "I'll go down into the coppice," he thought. He ran down through the fields, reached the pond just as the sun rose, and passed into the coppice. Bluebells carpeted the ground there. Among the larch trees there was mystery, the air, as it were, composed of that romantic quality. John sniffed its freshness, and stared at the bluebells in the sharpening light. Fleur! It rhymed with her, and she lived at Maple Durham. A jolly name, too, on the river somewhere. He could find it in the atlas presently. He would write to her. But would she answer? Oh, she must. She'd said au revoir, not good-bye. What luck that she had dropped her handkerchief. He would never have known her but for that. And the more he thought of that handkerchief, the more amazing his luck seemed. Fleur! It certainly rhymed with her. Rhythm thronged his head, words jostled to be joined together. He was on the verge of a poem. John remained in this condition for more than half an hour, then returned to the house, and, getting a ladder, climbed in at his bedroom window out of sheer exhilaration. Then, remembering that the study window was open, he went down and shut it, first removing the ladder, so as to obliterate all traces of his feeling. The thing was too deep to be revealed to mortal soul, even to his mother. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 4 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3. To Let by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 4. The Mausoleum. There are houses whose souls have passed into the limbo of time, leaving their bodies in the limbo of London. Such was not quite the condition of Timothy's on the Bayswater Road, for Timothy's soul still had one foot in Timothy Forsyte's body, and Smither kept the atmosphere unchanging, of camphor and port wine, and house whose windows are only open to air it twice a day. To Forsyte imagination, that house was now a sort of Chinese pill-box, a series of layers, in the last of which was Timothy. One did not reach him, or so it was reported by members of the family, who, out of old-time habit or absent-mindedness, would drive up once in a blue moon and ask after their surviving uncle. Such were Francie, now quite emancipated from God. She frankly avowed atheism. Euphemia, emancipated from old Nicholas, and Winifred Darty from her Man of the World. But after all, everybody was emancipated now, or said they were, perhaps not quite the same thing. When Soames, therefore, took it on his way to Paddington Station on the morning after that encounter, it was hardly with the expectation of seeing Timothy in the flesh. His heart made a faint demonstration within him while he stood in full south sunlight on the newly whitened doorstep of that little house where 4 Forsytes had once lived, and now but one dwelt on, like a winter fly. The house into which Soames had come, and out of which he had gone, time without number, divested of, or burdened with, fardels of family gossip, the house of the old people of another century, another age. The sight of Smither, still corseted up to the armpits, because the new fashion which came in as they were going out about 1903 had never been considered nice by Aunts Julie and Hester, brought a pale friendliness to Soames's lips. Smither, still faithfully arranged to old pattern in every detail, an invaluable servant, none such left, smiling back at him with the words, "Why, it's Mr. Soames after all this time. And how are you, sir? Mr. Timothy will be so pleased to know you've been." "How is he?" "Oh, he keeps fairly bobbish for his age, sir. But of course he's a wonderful man. As I said to Mrs. Darty when she was here last, it would please Miss Forsyte and Mrs. Julie and Miss Hester to see how he relishes a baked apple still. But he's quite deaf, and a mercy, I always think. For what we should have done with him in the air raids, I don't know." "Ah," said Soames, "what did you do with him?" "We just left him in his bed, and had the bell run down into the cellar, so that cook and I could hear him if he rang. It would never have done to let him know there was a war on. As I said to cook, if Mr. Timothy rings, they may do what they like. I'm going up. My dear mistresses would have a fit if they could see him ringing and nobody going to him. But he slept through them all beautiful. And the one in the daytime, he was having his bath. It was a mercy, because he might have noticed the people in the street all looking up. He often looks out of the window." "Quite," murmured Soames. Smither was getting garrulous. "I just want to look round and see if there's anything to be done." "Yes, sir. I don't think there's anything except a smell of mice in the dining-room that we don't know how to get rid of. It's funny they should be there, and not a crumb, since Mr. Timothy took to not coming down, just before the war. But they're nasty little things. You never know where they'll take you next." "Does he leave his bed?" "Oh, yes, sir. He takes nice exercise between his bed and the window in the morning, not to risk a change of air. And he's quite comfortable in himself. Has his will out every day regular. It's a great consolation to him, that." "Well, Smither, I want to see him if I can, in case he has anything to say to me." Smither coloured up above her corsets. "It will be an occasion," she said. "Shall I take you round the house, sir, when I send cook to break it to him?" "No, you go to him," said Soames. "I can go round the house by myself." One could not confess to sentiment before another, and Soames felt that he was going to be sentimental, nosing round those rooms so saturated with the past. When Smither, creaking with excitement, had left him, Soames entered the dining-room and sniffed. In his opinion it wasn't mice, but incipient wood-rot, and he examined the panelling. Whether it was worth a coat of paint at Timothy's age, he was not sure. The room had always been the most modern in the house, and only a faint smile curled Soames's lips and nostrils. Walls of a rich green surmounted the oak dado. A heavy metal chandelier hung by a chain from a ceiling divided by imitation beams. The pictures had been bought by Timothy, a bargain, one day at Jobson's, 60 years ago. 3 Snyder still lifes, 2 faintly coloured drawings of a boy and a girl, rather charming, which bore the initials J.R. Timothy had always believed they might turn out to be Joshua Reynolds, but Soames, who admired them, had discovered that they were only John Robinson, and a doubtful moorland of a white pony being shod. Deep red plushed curtains, 10 high-backed dark mahogany chairs with deep red plush seats, a Turkey carpet, and a mahogany dining table as large as the room was small. Such was an apartment which Soames could remember unchanged in soul or body since he was 4 years old. He looked especially at the 2 drawings and thought, "I shall buy those at the sale." From the dining-room he passed into Timothy's study. He did not remember ever having been into that room. It was lined from floor to ceiling with volumes, and he looked at them with curiosity. One wall seemed devoted to educational books, which Timothy's firm had published to 2 generations back, sometimes as many as 20 copies of one book. Soames read their titles and shuddered. The middle wall had precisely the same books as used to be in the library at his own father's in Park Lane, from which he deduced the fancy that James and his youngest brother had gone out together one day and bought a brace of small libraries. The third wall he approached with more excitement. Here surely Timothy's own taste would be found. It was. The books were dummies. The fourth wall was all heavily curtained window, and turned toward it was a large chair with a mahogany reading-stand attached, on which a yellowish and folded copy of The Times, dated July the 6th, 1914, the day Timothy first failed to come down, as if in preparation for the war. It seemed waiting for him still. In a corner stood a large globe of that world never visited by Timothy, deeply convinced of the unreality of anything but England, and permanently upset by the sea, on which he had been very sick one Sunday afternoon in 1836, out of a pleasure boat off the pier at Brighton, with Julie and Hester, Swithin and Hattie Chessman, all due to Swithin, who was always taking things into his head, and who, thank goodness, had been sick too. Soames knew all about it, having heard the tale 50 times at least from one or other of them. He went up to the globe and gave it a spin. It emitted a faint creak, and moved about an inch, bringing into his purview a daddy-long-legs which had died on it in latitude 44. Mausoleum, he thought. George was right. And he went out and up the stairs. On the half landing he stopped before the case of stuffed humming-birds which had delighted his childhood. They looked not a day older, suspended on wires above pampas grass. If the case were opened, the words would not begin to hum, but the whole thing would crumble, he suspected. It wouldn't be worth putting that into the sale. And suddenly he was caught by a memory of Aunt Anne, dear old Aunt Anne, holding him by the hand in front of that case and saying, "Look, Sammy, aren't they bright and pretty, dear little humming-birds?" Soames remembered his own answer. "They don't hum, Auntie." He must have been 6, in a black velveteen suit with a light blue collar. He remembered that suit well. Aunt Anne, with her ringlets and her spidery kind hands, and her grave old aquiline smile. A fine old lady, Aunt Anne. He moved on up to the drawing-room door. There, on each side of it, were the groups of miniatures. Those he would certainly buy in. The miniatures of his 4 aunts, one of his Uncle Swithin, adolescent, and one of his Uncle Nicholas as a boy. They'd all been painted by a young lady friend of the family at the time, 1830 about, when miniatures were considered very genteel, and lasting too, painted as they were, on ivory. Many a time had he heard the tale of that young lady. Very talented, my dear. She had quite a weakness for Swithin, and very soon after she went into a consumption and died. So like Keats. We often spoke of it. Well, there they were. Anne, Julie, Hester, Susan, quite a small child, Swithin, with sky-blue eyes, pink cheeks, yellow curls, white waistcoat large as life, and Nicholas, like Cupid with an eye on heaven. Now he came to think of it, Uncle Nick had always been rather like that, a wonderful man to the last. Yes, she must have had talent, and miniatures always had a certain backwatered cachet of their own, little subject to the currents of competition on aesthetic change. Soames opened the drawing-room door. The room was dusted, the furniture uncovered, the curtains drawn back, precisely as if his aunt still dwelt there patiently waiting. And a thought came to him. When Timothy died, why not? Would it not be almost a duty to preserve this house, like Carlyle's, and put up a tablet and show it? Specimen of mid-Victorian abode. Entrance 1 shilling with catalogue. After all, it was the completest thing, and perhaps the deadest, in the London of to-day. Perfect in its special taste and culture, if, that is, he took down and carried over to his own collection the 4 Barbizon pictures he had given them. The still sky-blue walls, tile-green curtains patterned with red flowers and ferns, the crewel-worked fire-screen before the cast-iron grate, the mahogany cupboard with glass windows full of little knick-knacks, the beaded footstools, Keats, Shelley, Southey, Cooper, Coleridge, Byron's Corsair, but nothing else, and the Victorian poets in a bookshelf row, the marquetry cabinet lined with dim red plush full of family relics, Hester's first fan, the buckles of their mother's father's shoes, 3 bottled scorpions, and 1 very yellow elephant's tusk, sent home from India by great-uncle Edgar Forsyte, who had been in jute. A yellow bit of paper propped up with spidery writing on it, recording God knew what, and the pictures crowding on the walls, all water-colours save those 4 Barbizons, looking like the foreigners they were, and doubtful customers at that, pictures bright and illustrative, telling the bees, "Hey for the ferry," and 2 in the style of Frith, all thimble-rig and crinolines, given them by Swithin. Oh, many, many pictures at which Soames had gazed 1,000 times in supercilious fascination, a marvellous collection of bright, smooth, gilt frames. And the boudoir grand piano, beautifully dusted, hermetically sealed as ever, and Aunt Julie's album of pressed seaweed on it, and the gilt-legged chairs, stronger than they looked, and on one side of the fireplace the sofa of crimson silk, where Aunt Anne and after Aunt Julie had been wont to sit, facing the light and bolt upright, and on the other side of the fire the one really easy chair, back to the light, for Aunt Hester. Soames screwed up his eyes. He seemed to see them sitting there. Ha! And the atmosphere, even now, of too many stuffs and washed laced curtains, lavender in bags, and dried bees' wings. No, he thought, there's nothing like it left. It ought to be preserved. And by George, they might laugh at it, but for a standard of gentle life never departed from, for fastidiousness of skin and eye and nose and feeling, it beat to-day hollow. To-day, with its tubes and cars, its perpetual smoking, its cross-legged, bare-necked girls visible up to the knees and down to the waist, if you took the trouble, agreeable to the satire within each Forsyte, but hardly his idea of a lady, with their feet, too, screwed round the legs of their chairs while they ate, and their so-longs, and their old beans, and their laughter, girls who gave him the shudders whenever he thought of Fleur in contact with them, and the hard-eyed, capable older women who managed life and gave him the shudders too. No, his old aunts, if they never opened their minds, their eyes, or very much their windows, at least had manners and a standard and reverence for past and future. With rather a choky feeling he closed the door and went tiptoeing upstairs. He looked in at a place on the way. Huh! in perfect order of the 80s, with a sort of yellow oilskin paper on the walls. At the top of the stairs he hesitated between 4 doors. Which of them was Timothy's? And he listened. A sound, as of a child slowly dragging a hobby-horse about, came to his ears. That must be Timothy. He tapped, and a door was opened by Smither, very red in the face. Mr. Timothy was taking his walk, and she had not been able to get him to attend. If Mr. Soames would come into the back room, he could see him through the door. Soames went into the back room and stood, watching. The last of the old Forsytes was on his feet, moving with the most impressive slowness, and an air of perfect concentration on his own affairs, backward and forward, between the foot of his bed and the window, a distance of some 12 feet. The lower part of his square face, no longer clean-shaven, was covered with snowy beard, clipped as short as it could be, and his chin looked as broad as his brow, where the hair was also quite white, while nose and cheeks and brow were a good yellow. One hand held a stout stick, and the other grasped the skirt of his Jaeger dressing-gown, from under which could be seen his bed-socked ankles and feet thrust into Jaeger slippers. The expression on his face was that of a crossed child intent on something that he has not got. Each time he turned he stumped the stick, and then dragged it, as if to show that he could do without it. "He still looks strong," said Soames under his breath. "Oh, yes, sir. You should see him take his bath. It's wonderful. He does enjoy it so." Those quite loud words gave Soames an insight. Timothy had resumed his babyhood. "Does he take any interest in things generally?" he said, also loud. "Oh, yes, sir. His food and his will. It's quite a sight to see him turn it over and over, not to read it, of course. And every now and then he asks the price of consols, and I write it on a slate for him, very large. Of course I always write the same, what they were when he last took notice in 1914. We got the doctor to forbid him to read the paper when the war broke out. Oh, he did take on about that at first, but he soon came round because he knew it tired him, and he's a wonder to conserve energy, as he used to call it when my dear mistresses were alive, bless their hearts. How he did go on at them about that! They were always so active, if you remember, Mr. Soames." "What would happen if I were to go in?" asked Soames. "Would he remember me? I made his will, you know, after Miss Hester died in 1907. "Oh, that, sir," replied Smither doubtfully, "I couldn't take on me to say. I think he might. He really is a wonderful man for his age." Soames moved into the doorway, and waiting for Timothy to turn, said in a loud voice, "Uncle Timothy!" Timothy trailed back half-way and halted. "Huh?" he said. "Soames!" cried Soames at the top of his voice, holding out his hand. "Soames Forsyte!" "No," said Timothy, and stumping his stick loudly on the floor, he continued his walk. "It doesn't seem to work," said Soames. "No, sir," replied Smither, rather crestfallen. "You see, he hasn't finished his walk. It always was one thing at a time with him. I expect you'll ask me this afternoon if you came about the gas, and a pretty job I shall have to make him understand." "Do you think he ought to have a man about him?" Smither held up her hands. "A man? Oh, no! Cook and me can manage perfectly. A strange man about would send him crazy in no time, and my mistresses wouldn't like the idea of a man in the house. Besides, we're so proud of him." "I suppose the doctor comes?" "Every morning. He makes special terms for such a quantity. Mr. Timothy's so used, he doesn't take a bit of notice, except to put out his tongue." "Well," said Soames, turning away, "it's rather sad and painful to me." "Oh, sir," returned Smither anxiously, "you mustn't think that. Now that he can't worry about things, he quite enjoys his life, really he does. As I say to cook, Mr. Timothy is more of a man than he ever was. You see, when he's not walking or taking his bath, he's eating, and when he's not eating, he's sleeping. And there it is. There isn't an ache or a care about him anywhere." "Well," said Soames, "there's something in that. I'll go down. By the way, let me see his will."
"Oh, I should have to take my time about that, sir. He keeps it under his pillow, and he'd see me while he's active."
"I only want to know if it's the one I made," said Soames. "You take a look at its date some time, and let me know."
"Yes, sir. But I'm sure it is the same, because me and Cook witnessed, you remember, and there's our names on it still, and we've only done it once."
"Quite," said Soames. He did remember. Smither and Jane had been proper witnesses, having been left nothing in the will that they might have no interest in Timothy's death. It had been, he fully admitted, an almost improper precaution, but Timothy had wished it, and after all Aunt Hester had provided for them amply. "Very well," he said. "Good-bye, Smither. Look after him, and if he should say anything at any time, put it down and let me know." "Oh, yes, Mr. Soames, I'll be sure to do that. It's been such a pleasant change to see you. Cook will be quite excited when I tell her." Soames shook her hand and went downstairs. He stood for fully 2 minutes by the hat-stand whereon he had hung his hat so many times. So it all passes, he was thinking. Passes and begins again. Poor old chap. And he listened, if perchance the sound of Timothy trailing his hobby-horse might come down the well of the stairs, or some ghost of an old face show over the banisters, and an old voice say, "Why, it's dear Soames, and we were only saying that we hadn't seen him for a week." Nothing, nothing, just the scent of camphor and dust-motes in a sunbeam through the fanlight over the door. The little old house, a mausoleum. And, turning on his heel, he went out and caught his train. End of Part 1, Chapter 4. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 5 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 5, The Native Heath. His foot's upon his native heath, his name's Val Darty. With some such feeling did Val Darty, in the 40th year of his age, set out that same Thursday morning very early from the old manor house he had taken on the north side of the Sussex Downs. His destination was Newmarket, and he had not been there since the autumn of 1899, when he stole over from Oxford for the Cambridgeshire. He paused at the door to give his wife a kiss, and put a flask of port in his pocket. "Don't overtire your leg, Val, and don't bet too much." With the pressure of her chest against his own, and his eyes looking into his, Val felt both leg and pocket safe. He should be moderate. Holly was always right. She had a natural aptitude. It did not seem so remarkable to him, perhaps, as it might to others, that, half Darty as he was, he should have been perfectly faithful to his young first cousin during the 20 years since he married her romantically out in the Boer War, and faithful without any feeling of sacrifice or boredom. She was so quick, so slyly always a little in front of his mood. Being first cousins, they had decided, rather needlessly, to have no children, and though a little sallower, she had kept her looks, her slimness, and the colour of her dark hair. Val particularly admired the life of her own she carried on, besides carrying on his, and riding better every year. She kept up her music. She read an awful lot, novels, poetry, all sorts of stuff. Out on their farm in Cape Colony, she looked after all the nigger babies and women in a miraculous manner. She was, in fact, clever, yet made no fuss about it, and had no side. Though not remarkable for humility, Val had come to have the feeling that she was his superior, and he did not grudge it, a great tribute. It might be noted that he never looked at Holly without her knowing of it, but that she looked at him sometimes unawares. He had kissed her in the porch, because he should not be doing so on the platform, though she was going to the station with him to drive the car back. Tanned and wrinkled by colonial weather,
and the wiles inseparable from horses, and handicapped by the leg which, weakened in the Boer War, had probably saved his life in the war just past, Val was still much as he had been in the days of his courtship, his smile as wide and charming, his eyelashes if anything thicker and darker, his eyes screwed up under them as bright a grey, his freckles rather deeper, his hair a little grizzled at the sides. He gave the impression of one who has lived actively with horses in a sunny climate. Twisting the car sharp round at the gate, he said, "When is young John coming?" "To-day." "Is there anything you want for him? I could bring it down on Saturday." "No, but you might come down by the same train as Fleur, 1:40. Val gave the Ford full rein. He still drove like a man in a new country on bad roads, who refuses to compromise, and expects heaven at every hole. "That's a young woman who knows her way about," he said. "I say, has it struck you?" "Yes," said Holly. "Uncle Soames and your dad. Bit awkward, isn't it?" "She won't know, and he won't know, and nothing must be said, of course. It's only for 5 days, Val." "Stable secret, right-ho." If Holly thought it safe, it was. Glancing slyly round at him, she said, "Did you notice how beautifully she asked herself?" "No." "Well, she did. What do you think of her, Val?" "Pretty and clever, but she might run out at any corner if she got her monkey up, I should say." "I'm wondering," Holly murmured, "whether she is the modern young woman. One feels at sea coming home into all this." "You? You get the habit of things so quick." Holly slid her hand into his coat pocket. "You keep one in the know," said Val, encouraged. "What do you think of that Belgian fellow, Profond?" "I think he's rather a good devil." Val grinned. "He seems to me a queer fish for a friend of our family. In fact, our family is in pretty queer waters, with Uncle Soames marrying a Frenchwoman, and your dad marrying Soames's first. Our grandfathers would have had fits." "So would anybody's, my dear." "This car," Val said suddenly, "wants rousing. She doesn't get her hind legs under her uphill. I shall have to give her her head on the slope if I'm to catch that train." There was that about horses which had prevented him from ever really sympathizing with a car, and the running of the Ford under his guidance compared with its running under that of Holly was always noticeable. He caught the train. "Take care going home. She'll throw you down if she can. Good-bye, darling." "Good-bye," called Holly, and kissed her hand. In the train, after a quarter of an hour's indecision between thoughts of Holly, his morning paper, the look of the bright day, and his dim memory of Newmarket, Val plunged into the recesses of a small square book, all names, pedigrees, taproots, and notes about the make and shape of horses. The Forsyte in him was bent on the acquisition of a certain strain of blood, and he was subduing resolutely as yet the darty hankering for a nutter. On getting back to England, after the profitable sale of his South African farm and stud, and observing that the sun seldom shone, Val had said to himself, "I've absolutely got to have an interest in life, or this country will give me the blues. Hunting's not enough. I'll breed, and I'll train." With just that extra pinch of shrewdness and decision imparted by long residence in a new country, Val had seen the weak point of modern breeding. They were all hypnotized by fashion and high price. He should buy for looks, and let names go hang. And here he was already, hypnotized by the prestige of a certain strain of blood. Half-consciously he thought, "There's something in this damned climate which makes one go round in a ring. All the same, I must have a strain of Mayfly blood." In this mood he reached the Mecca of his hopes. It was one of those quiet meetings favourable to such as wished to look into horses rather than into the mouths of bookmakers, and Val clung to the paddock. His 20 years of colonial life, divesting him of the dandyism in which he had been bred, had left him the essential neatness of the horseman, and given him a queer and rather blighting eye over what he called the silly haw-haw of some Englishmen, the flapping cockatourie of some English women. Holly had none of that, and Holly was his model. Observant,
Quick, resourceful, Val went straight to the heart of a transaction, a horse, a drink, and he was on his way to the heart of a mayfly filly when a slow voice said at his elbow, "Mr. Valdarty? How's Mrs. Valdarty? She's well, I hope." And he saw beside him the Belgian he had met at his sister Imogen's. "Prosper Profond, I met you at lunch," said the voice. "How are you?" murmured Val. "I'm very well," replied Monsieur Profond, smiling with a certain inimitable slowness. A good devil, Holly had called him. Well, he looked a little like a devil with his dark, clipped, pointed beard. A sleepy one, though, and good-humoured, with fine eyes, unexpectedly intelligent. "Here's a gentleman wants to know you, cousin of yours, Mr. George Forsyte." Val saw a large form and a face clean-shaven, bull-like, a little lowering, with sardonic humour bubbling behind a full grey eye. He remembered it dimly from old days when he would dine with his father at the Iseeum Club. "I used to go racing with your father," George was saying. "How's the stud? Like to buy one of my screws?" Val grinned, to hide the sudden feeling that the bottom had fallen out of breeding. They believed in nothing over here, not even in horses. George Forsyte, Prosper Profond. The devil himself was not more disillusioned than those two. "Didn't know you were a racing man," he said to Monsieur Profond. "I'm not. I don't care for it. I'm a yachting man. I don't care for yachting either, but I like to see my friends. I've got some lunch, Mr. Valdarty, just a small lunch, if you'd like to have some. Not much, just a small one. In my car." "Thanks," said Val. "Very good of you. I'll come along in about a quarter of an hour." "Over there? Mr. Forsyte's coming?" And Mr. Profond pointed with a yellow gloved finger. "A small car with a small lunch." He moved on, groomed, sleepy, and remote, George Forsyte following, neat, huge, and with his jesting air. Val remained gazing at the mayfly filly. George Forsyte, of course, was an old chap, but this Profond must be about his own age. Val felt extremely young, as if the mayfly filly were a toy at which those two had laughed. The animal had lost reality. "That small mare," he seemed to hear the voice of Monsieur Profond. "What do you see in her? We must all die." And George Forsyte, crony of his father, racing still. The mayfly strain, was it any better than any other? He might just as well have a flutter with his money instead. "No, my gum," he muttered suddenly. "If it's no good breeding horses, it's no good doing anything. What did I come for? I'll buy her." He stood back and watched the ebb of the paddock visitors towards the stand. Natty old chips, shrewd, portly fellows, Jews, trainers looking as if they had never been guilty of seeing a horse in their lives, tall, flapping, languid women, or brisk, loud-voiced women, young men with an air as if trying to take it seriously, 2 or 3 of them with only one arm. Life over here's a game, thought Val. Muffin bell rings, horses run, money changes hands, ring again, run again, money changes back. But alarmed at his own philosophy, he went to the paddock gate to watch the mayfly filly canter down. She moved well, and he made his way over to the small car. The small lunch was the sort a man dreams of but seldom gets, and when it was concluded, Monsieur Profond walked back with him to the paddock. "Your wife's a nice woman," was his surprising remark. "Nicest woman I know," returned Val dryly. "Yes," said Monsieur Profond. "She has a nice face. I admire nice women." Val looked at him suspiciously, but something kindly and direct in the heavy diabolism of his companion disarmed him for the moment. "Any time you like to come on my yacht, I'll give her a small cruise." "Thanks," said Val, in arms again. "She hates the sea." "So do I," said Monsieur Profond. "Then why do you yacht?" The Belgian's eyes smiled. "Oh, I don't know. I've done everything. It's the last thing I'm doing. It must be damned expensive. I should want more reason than that." Monsieur Prosper Profond raised his eyebrows and puffed out a heavy lower lip. "I'm an easy-going man," he said.
Were you in the war?" asked Val. "Yes, I've done that too. I was gassed. It was a small bit unpleasant." He smiled with a deep and sleepy air of prosperity, as if he had caught it from his name. Whether his saying "small" when he ought to have said "little" was genuine mistake or affectation, Val could not decide. The fellow was evidently capable of anything. Among the ring of buyers round the Mayfly filly who had won her race, Monsieur Profond said, "You going to bid?" Val nodded. With this sleepy Satan at his elbow, he felt in need of faith. Though placed above the ultimate blows of Providence by the forethought of a grandfather who tied him up 1,000 a year, to which was added the 1,000 a year tied up for Holly by her grandfather, Val was not flush of capital that he could touch, having spent most of what he had realized from his South African farm on his establishment in Sussex. And very soon he was thinking, "Dash it, she's going beyond me." His limit, 600, was exceeded. He dropped out of the bidding. The Mayfly filly passed under the hammer at 750 guineas. He was turning away vexed, when the slow voice of Mr. Profond said in his ear, "Well, I've bought that small filly, but I don't want her. You take her, and give her to your wife." Val looked at the fellow with renewed suspicion, but the good humour in his eyes was such that he really could not take offence. "I made a small amount of money in the war," began Monsieur Profond in answer to that look. "I had armament shares. I like to give it away. I'm always making money. I want a very small lot myself. I like my friends to have it." "I'll buy her of you at the price you gave," said Val with sudden resolution. "No," said Monsieur Profond. "You take her. I don't want her." "Hang it, one doesn't—" "Why not?" smiled Monsieur Profond. "I'm a friend of your family." 750 guineas is not a box of cigars," said Val impatiently. "All right. You keep her for me till I want her, and do what you like with her." "So long as she's yours," said Val, "I don't mind that." "That's all right," murmured Monsieur Profond, and moved away. Val watched. He might be a good devil, but then again he might not. He saw him rejoin George Forsyte, and thereafter saw him no more. He spent those nights after racing at his mother's house in Green Street. Winifred Dartie, at 62, was marvellously preserved, considering the 33 years during which she put up with Montague Dartie, till almost happily released by a French staircase. It was to her a vehement satisfaction to have her favourite son back from South Africa after all this time, to feel him so little changed, and to have taken a fancy to his wife. Winifred, who in the late 70s before her marriage had been in the vanguard of freedom, pleasure, and fashion, confessed her youth outclassed by the donzellas of the day. They seemed, for instance, to regard marriage as an incident, and Winifred sometimes regretted that she had not done the same. A second, third, fourth incident might have secured her a partner of less dazzling inebriety, though after all he had left her Val, Imogen, Maud, Benedict, almost a colonel and unharmed by the war, none of whom had been divorced as yet. The steadiness of her children often amazed one who remembered their father, but as she was fond of believing, they were really all Forsytes, favouring herself, with the exception, perhaps, of Imogen. Her brother's little girl, Fleur, frankly puzzled Winifred. The child was as restless as any of these modern young women. "She's a small flame in a draught," Prosper Profond had said one day after dinner, but she did not flop or talk at the top of her voice. The steady Forsytism in Winifred's own character instinctively resented the feeling in the air, the modern girl's habits, and her motto, "All's much of a muchness, spend, tomorrow we shall be poor." She found it a saving grace in Fleur that, having set her heart on a thing, she had no change of heart until she got it, though what happened after, Fleur was of course too young to have made evident. The child was a very pretty little thing, too, and quite a credit to take about with her mother's French taste and gift for wearing clothes. Everybody turned to look at Fleur. Great consideration to Winifred, a lover of the style and distinction which had so cruelly deceived her in the case of Montague Dartie. In discussing her with Val at breakfast on Saturday morning, Winifred dealt on the family skeleton. "That little affair of your father-in-law and your Aunt Irene, Val. It's old as the hills, of course. Fleur need know nothing about it, making a fuss. Your Uncle Soames is very particular about that, so you'll be careful." "Yes, but it's dashed awkward. Holly's young half-brother is coming to live with us while he learns farming. He's there already." "Ah," said Winifred, "that is a gaff. What is he like?" "Only saw him once, at Robin Hill, when we were home in 1909. He was naked and painted blue and yellow in stripes. A jolly little chap." Winifred thought that rather nice, and added comfortably, "Well, Holly's sensible. She'll know how to deal with it. I shan't tell your uncle. It'll only bother him. It's a great comfort to have you back, my dear boy, now that I'm getting on." "Getting on? Why, you're as young as ever. That chap Profound, mother, is he all right?" "Prosper Profound? Oh, the most amusing man I know." Val grunted and recounted the story of the Mayfly filly. "That's so like him," murmured Winifred. "He does all sorts of things." "Well," said Val shrewdly, "our family haven't been too lucky with that kind of cattle. They're too light-hearted for us." It was true, and Winifred's blue study lasted a full minute before she answered, "Oh, well, he's a foreigner, Val. One must make allowances." "All right. I'll use his filly and make it up to him somehow." And soon after he gave her his blessing, received a kiss, and left her for his bookmakers, the Iseeum Club, and Victoria Station. End of Part 1, Chapter 5. Recording by Simon Evers. To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3. To Let by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 6. John. Mrs. Val Darty, after 20 years of South Africa, had fallen deeply in love, fortunately with something of her own, for the object of her passion was the prospect in front of her windows, the cool, clear light on the green downs. It was England again, at last. England more beautiful than she had dreamed. Chance had, in fact, guided the Val Dartys to a spot where the South Downs had real charm when the sun shone. Holly had enough of her father's eye to apprehend the rare quality of their outlines and chalky radiance. To go up there by the ravine-like lane and wander along towards Chanctonbury or Amberley was still a delight which she hardly attempted to share with Val, whose admiration of nature was confused by a Forsyte's instinct for getting something out of it, such as the condition of the turf for his horse's exercise. Driving the Ford home with a certain humouring smoothness, she promised herself that the first use she would make of John would be to take him up there and show him the view under this May-day sky. She was looking forward to her young half-brother with a motherliness not exhausted by Val. A 3-day visit to Robin Hill soon after their arrival home had yielded no sight of him. He was still at school, so that her recollection, like Val's, was of a little sunny-haired boy, striped blue and yellow, down by the pond. Those 3 days at Robin Hill had been exciting, sad, embarrassing. Memories of her dead brother, memories of Val's courtship, the ageing of her father, not seen for 20 years, something funereal in his ironic gentleness which did not escape one who had much subtle instinct. Above all, the presence of her stepmother, whom she could still vaguely remember as the Lady in Grey of days when she was little and grandfather alive, and Mademoiselle Bois so cross because that intruder gave her music lessons. All these confused and tantalized a spirit which had longed to find Robin Hill untroubled. But Holly was adept at keeping things to herself, and all had seemed to go quite well. Her father had kissed her when she left him, with lips which she was sure had trembled. "Well, my dear," he said, "the war hasn't changed Robin Hill, has it? If only you could have brought Jolly back with you. I say, can you stand this spiritualistic racket? When the oak tree dies, it dies, I'm afraid." From the warmth of her embrace he probably divined that he had let the cat out of the bag, for he rode off at once on irony. "Spiritualism, queer word, when the more they manifest, the more they prove that they've got hold of matter." "How?" said Holly. "Why, look at their photographs of auric presences. You must have something material for light and shade to fall on before you can take a photograph. No, it'll end in our calling all matter spirit, or all spirit matter. I don't know which." "But don't you believe in survival, Dad?" Jolyon had looked at her, and the sad whimsicality of his face impressed her deeply. "Well, my dear, I should like to get something out of death. I've been looking into it a bit, but for the life of me I can't find anything that telepathy, subconsciousness, and emanation from the storehouse of this world can't account for just as well. Wish I could. Wish his father thought, but they don't breed evidence." Holly had pressed her lips again to his forehead, with the feeling that it confirmed his theory that all matter was becoming spirit. His brow felt somehow so insubstantial. But the most poignant memory of that little village had been watching, unobserved, her stepmother reading to herself a letter from John. It was, she decided, the prettiest sight she had ever seen. Irene, lost as it were in the letter of her boy, stood at a window, where the light fell on her face and her fine grey hair. Her lips were moving, smiling, her dark eyes laughing, dancing, and the hand which did not hold the letter was pressed against her breast. Holly withdrew as from a vision of perfect love, convinced that John must be nice. When she saw him coming out of the station with a kit-bag in either hand, she was confirmed in her predisposition. He was a little like Jolly, that long-lost idol of her childhood, but eager-looking and less formal, with deeper eyes and brighter-coloured hair, for he wore no hat. Altogether a very interesting little brother. His tentative politeness charmed one who was accustomed to assurance in the youthful manner. He was disturbed because she was to drive him home instead of his driving her. Shouldn't he have a shot? There hadn't a car at Robin Hill since the war, of course, and he'd only driven once, and landed up a bank, so she oughtn't to mind his trying. His laugh, soft and infectious, was very attractive, though that word she had heard was now quite old-fashioned. When they reached the house, he pulled out a crumpled letter, which she read while he was washing. A quite short letter, which must have cost her father many a pang to write. "My dear, you and Val will not forget, I trust, that John knows nothing of family history. His mother and I think he is too young at present. The boy is very dear, and the apple of her eye. Verbum sapientibus, your loving father, J.F." That was all, but it renewed in Holly an uneasy regret that Fleur was coming. After tea she fulfilled that promise to herself and took John up the hill. They had a long talk, sitting above an old chalk pit grown over with brambles and goosepenny. Milkwort and liverwort starred the green slope, the larks sang, and thrushes in the brake, and now and then a gull, flighting inland, would wheel very white against the paling sky, where the vague moon was coming up. Delicious fragrance came to them, as if little invisible creatures were running and treading scent out of the blades of grass. John, who had fallen silent, said rather suddenly, "I say, this is wonderful. There's no fat on it at all. Gull's flight and sheep's bells." "Gull's flight and sheep's bells? You're a poet, my dear." John sighed. "Oh, golly, no go." "Try. I used to at your age." "Did you? Mother says try too, but I'm so rotten. Have you any of yours for me to see?" "My dear," Holly murmured, "I've been married 19 years. I only wrote verses when I wanted to be." "Oh," said John, and turned over on his face. The one cheek she could see was a charming colour. Was John touched in the wind, then, as Val would have called it, already? But if so, all the better. He would take no notice of young Fleur.
Besides, on Monday he would begin his farming. And she smiled. Was it Burns who followed the plough, or only Piers Ploughman? Nearly every young man and most young women seemed to be poets now, judging from the number of their books she had read out in South Africa, importing them from Hatches and Bumfards, and quite good. Oh, quite. Much better than she had been herself. But then poetry had only really come in since her day, with motor cars. Another long talk after dinner over a wood fire in the low hall, and there seemed little left to know about John except anything of real importance. Holly parted from at his bedroom door, having seen twice over that he had everything, with the conviction that she would love him, and Val would like him. He was eager, but did not gush. He was a splendid listener, sympathetic, reticent about himself. He evidently loved their father, and adored his mother. He liked riding, rowing, and fencing better than games. He saved moths from candles and couldn't bear spiders, but put them out of doors in screws of paper sooner than kill them. In a word, he was amiable. She went to sleep thinking that he would suffer horribly if anybody hurt him. But who would hurt him? John, on the other hand, sat awake at his window with a bit of paper and a pencil, writing his first real poem, by the light of a candle, because there was not enough moon to see by, only enough to make the night seem fluttery, and as if engraved on silver. Just the night for Fleur to walk, and turn her eyes, and lead on, over the hills and far away. And John, deeply furrowed in his ingenuous brow, made marks on the paper, and rubbed them out, and wrote them in again, and did all that was necessary for the completion of a work of art. And he had a feeling such as the winds of spring must have, trying their first songs among the coming blossom. John was one of those boys, not many, in whom a home-trained love of beauty had survived school life. He had had to keep it to himself, of course, so that not even the drawing-master knew of it, but it was there, fastidious and clear within him. And his poem seemed to him as lame and stilted as the night was winged. But he kept it all the same. It was a beast, but better than nothing as an expression of the inexpressible. And he thought with a sort of discomfiture, I shan't be able to show it to Mother. He slept terribly well when he did sleep, overwhelmed by novelty. End of Part 1, Chapter 6. Recording by Simon Evers.
Chapter 7 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 7, Fleur. To avoid the awkwardness of questions which could not be answered, all that had been told John was, "There's a girl coming down with Val for the week-end." For the same reason, all that had been told Fleur was, "We've got a youngster staying with us." The two yearlings, as Val called them in his thoughts, met therefore in a manner which for unpreparedness left nothing to be desired. They were thus introduced by Holly. "This is John, my little brother. Fleur is a cousin of ours, John." John, who was coming in through a French window out of strong sunlight, was so confounded by the providential nature of this miracle that he had time to hear Fleur say calmly, "Oh, how do you do?" as if he had never seen her, and to understand dimly from the quickest imaginable little movement of her head that he never had seen her. He bowed therefore over her hand in an intoxicated manner, and became more silent than the grave. He knew better than to speak. Once in his early life, surprised reading by a night-light, he had said fatuously, "I was just turning over the leaves, Mum," and his mother had replied, "John, never tell stories, because of your face nobody will ever believe them." The saying had permanently undermined the confidence necessary to the success of spoken untruth. He listened therefore to Fleur's swift and rapt allusions to the jolliness of everything, plied her with scones and jam, and got away as soon as might be. They say that in delirium tremens you see a fixed object, preferably dark, which suddenly changes shape and position. John saw the fixed object. It had dark eyes, and passably dark hair, and changed its position, but never its shape. The knowledge that between him and that object there was already a secret understanding, however impossible to understand, thrilled him so that he waited feverishly, and began to copy out his poem, which of course he would never dare to show her, till the sound of horses' hoofs roused him, and leaning from his window, he saw her riding forth with Val. It was clear that she wasted no time, but the sight filled him with grief. He wasted his. If he had not bolted, in his fearful ecstasy, he might have been asked to go too. And from his window he sat and watched them disappear, appear again in the chain of the road, vanish, and emerge once more for a minute clear on the outline of the down. Silly brute, he thought, I always miss my chances. Why couldn't he be self-confident and ready? And leaning his chin on his hands, he imagined the ride he might have had with her. A week-end was but a week-end, and he had missed 3 hours of it. Did he know anyone except himself who would have been such a flat? He did not. He dressed for dinner early, and was first down. He would miss no more. But he missed Fleur, who came down last. He sat opposite her at dinner, and it was terrible. Impossible to say anything for fear of saying the wrong thing. Impossible to keep his eyes fixed on her in the only natural way. In sum, impossible to treat normally one with whom in fancy he had already been over the hills and far away. Conscious, too, all the time, that he must seem to her, to all of them, a dumb gawk. Yes, it was terrible. And she was talking so well, swooping with swift wing this way and that. Wonderful how she had learned an art which he found so disgustingly difficult. She must think him hopeless indeed. His sister's eyes, fixed on him with a certain astonishment, obliged him at last to look at Fleur. But instantly her eyes, very wide and eager, seeming to say, "Oh, for goodness' sake," obliged him to look at Val, where a grin obliged him to look at his cutlet. That, at least, had no eyes and no grin, and he ate it hastily. "John is going to be a farmer," he heard Holly say. "A farmer and a poet." He glanced up reproachfully, caught the comic lift of her eyebrow just like their father's, laughed, and felt better. Val recounted the incident of Monsieur Prosper Profond. Nothing could have been more favourable, for, in relating it, he regarded Holly, who in turn regarded him, while Fleur seemed to be regarding with a slight frown some thought of her own, and John was really free to look at her at last. She had on a white frock, very simple and well made. Her arms were bare, and her hair had a white rose in it. In just that swift moment of free vision, after such intense discomfort, John saw her sublimated, as one sees in the dark a slender white fruit tree, caught her like a verse of poetry flashed before the eyes of the mind, or a tune which floats out in the distance and dies. He wondered giddily how old she was. She seemed so much more self-possessed and experienced than himself. Why mustn't he say they had met? He remembered suddenly his mother's face, puzzled, hurt-looking, when she answered, "Yes, they're relations, but we don't know them." Impossible that his mother, who loved beauty, should not admire Fleur, if she did know her. Alone with Val after dinner, he sipped port deferentially and answered the advances of this new-found brother-in-law. As to riding, always the first consideration with Val, he could have the young chestnut, saddle and unsaddle it himself, and generally look after it when he brought it in. John said he was accustomed to all that at home, and saw that he had gone up one in his host's estimation. "Fleur," said Val, "can't ride much yet, but she's keen. Of course her father doesn't know a horse from a cartwheel. Does your dad ride?" "He used to, but now he's—you know, he's He stopped, so hating the word. Old. His father was old, and yet not old. No, never. "Quite," muttered Val. "I used to know your brother up at Oxford, ages ago, the one who died in the Boer War. We had a fight in New College Gardens. That was a queer business," he added, musing. "A good deal came out of it." John's eyes opened wide. All was pushing him toward historical research, when his sister's voice said gently from the doorway, "Come along, you two." And he rose, his heart pushing him towards something far more modern. Fleur having declared that it was "simply too wonderful to stay indoors," they all went out. Moonlight was frosting the dew, and an old sundial threw a long shadow. Two box hedges at right angles, dark and square, barred off the orchard. Fleur turned through that angled opening. "Come on," she called. John glanced at the others and followed. She was running among the trees like a ghost. All was lovely and foam-like above her, and there was a scent of old trunks and of nettles. She vanished. He thought he had lost her, then almost ran into her standing quite still. "Isn't it jolly?" she cried, and John answered, "Rather." She reached up, twisted off a blossom, and twirling it in her fingers, said, "I suppose I can call you John?" "I should think so, just." "All right, but you know there's a feud between our families." John stammered, "Feud? Why?" "It's ever so romantic and silly. That's why I pretended we hadn't met. Shall we get up early to-morrow morning and go for a walk before breakfast and have it out? I hate being slow about things, don't you?" John murmured a rapturous assent. 6 o'clock, then. I think your mother's beautiful." John said fervently, "Yes, she is." "I love all kinds of beauty," went on Fleur. "When it's exciting. I don't like Greek things a bit." "What? Not Euripides?" "Euripides? Oh no! I can't bear Greek plays. They're so long. I think beauty's always swift. I like to look at one picture, for instance, and then run off. I can't bear a lot of things together. Look." She held up her blossom in the moonlight. "That's better than all the orchard, I think." And suddenly, with her other hand, she caught John's. "Of all things in the world, don't you think caution's the most awful? Smell the moonlight." She thrust the blossom against his face. John agreed giddily that of all things in the world caution was the worst, and bending over, kissed the hand which held his. "That's nice and old-fashioned," said Fleur calmly. "You're frightfully silent, John. Still, I like silence when it's swift." She let go his hand. "Did you think I dropped my handkerchief on purpose?" "No!" cried John, intensely shocked. "Well, I did, of course. Let's get back, or they'll think we're doing this on purpose too." And again she ran like a ghost among the trees. John followed, with love in his heart, spring in his heart, and over all the moonlit white unearthly blossom. They came out where they had gone in, Fleur walking demurely. "It's quite wonderful in there," she said dreamily to Holly. John preserved silence, hoping against hope that she might be thinking it swift. She bade him a casual and demure good night, which made him think he had been dreaming. In her bedroom, Fleur had flung off her gown, and wrapped in a shapeless garment with the white flower still in her hair, she looked like a mousme, sitting cross-legged on her bed, writing by candlelight. "Dearest Cherry, I believe I'm in love. I've got it in the neck, only the feeling is really lower down. He's a second cousin, such a child, about 6 months older and 10 years younger than I am. Boys always fall in love with their seniors, and girls with their juniors, or with old men of 40. Don't laugh, but his eyes are the truest things I ever saw, and he's quite divinely silent. We had a most romantic first meeting in London under the Vospovich Juno, and now he's sleeping in the next room, and the moonlight's on the blossom, and to-morrow morning before anybody's awake we're going to walk off into down fairyland. There's a feud between our families, which makes it really exciting. Yes, and I may have to use subterfuge and come on you for invitations, if so, you'll know why. My father doesn't want us to know each other, but I can't help that. Life's too short. He's got the most beautiful mother, with lovely silvery hair, and a young face with dark eyes. I'm staying with his sister, who married my cousin. It's all mixed up, but I mean to pump her to-morrow. We've often talked about love being a spoil-sport. Well, that's all tosh. It's the beginning of sport, and the sooner you feel it, my dear, the better for you. John, not simplified spelling, but short for Jolyon, which is a name in my family, they say, is the sort that lights up and goes out. About 5 feet 10, still growing, and I believe he's going to be a poet. If you laugh at me, I've done with you for ever. I perceive all sorts of difficulties, but you know when I really want a thing, I get it. One of the chief effects of love is that you see the air sort of inhabited, like seeing a face in the moon, and you feel dancy and soft at the same time, with a funny sensation, like a continual first sniff of orange blossom, just above your stays. This is my first, and I feel as if it were going to be my last, which is absurd, of course, by all the laws of nature and morality. If you mock me, I will smite you, and if you tell anybody, I will never forgive you. So much so that I almost don't think I'll send this letter. Anyway, I'll sleep over it. So good night, my cherry. Oh, your Fleur. End of Part 1, Chapter 7. Recording by Leanne Howlett.